April 18, 1942. Somewhere in the gray, violent water of the North Pacific, about 650 nautical miles east of Japan, the aircraft carrier USS Hornet rolled through heavy seas. Rain cut sideways across the flight deck. Wind pushed past 20 knots. Waves smashed against the bow and threw cold spray across the steel. And on that deck, chained from bow to stern, sat 16 B-25B Mitchell bombers. They did not belong there. These were Army aircraft, land bombers, machines built for long concrete runways, not for a wet, moving strip of steel in the middle of the ocean. The last bomber sat so far back that its tail hung over the stern, suspended above the Pacific. No B-25 had ever launched into combat from an aircraft carrier. No manual said this was possible. No doctrine supported it. No pilot had trained for this exact moment. And yet, the first aircraft waited at the bow. Its pilot had roughly 467 feet of deck, less than a tenth of a normal runway. The bomber weighed more than 31,000 pounds, overloaded with fuel and bombs. Every calculation said it should not fly. Every instinct said the ocean would take it. 2 white lines had been painted on the deck, one for the nose wheel, one for the left main gear. If the pilot held those lines perfectly, the right wingtip would clear the carrier's island by 6 feet. 6 feet, 1 gust, 1 drift, 1 mistake, and the wing would strike steel. Sailors stood along the edges of the deck, silent. They had seen Wildcats and Dauntless launch before, small, fast aircraft built for carrier war. But this was different. This bomber looked too large, too heavy, too wrong for the space around it. The engines came up to full power. The airframe shook. Rain streaked across the cockpit glass. Below deck, Hornet's own aircraft sat trapped in the hangar, pushed aside for this impossible cargo. The carrier could not launch its own planes. Her entire flight deck belonged to 16 Army bombers and 80 men. The deck officer watched the bow. Timing mattered. If the pilot released the brakes as the bow rose, the aircraft might gain just enough lift. If he released too late, the bow would fall and the bomber would roll off into a downward slope aimed at the sea. The flag dropped. The brakes released. The bomber surged forward. The deck vanished beneath it in seconds. The edge rushed closer. Then the wheels left the steel, and there was nothing below but gray water. For one terrible instant, the aircraft dipped toward the waves. Spray seemed close enough to touch its belly. Then the nose lifted. The engines held. The B-25 climbed slowly into the rain, turned west, and headed for Japan. Behind it, 15 more bombers waited. Each crew knew almost nothing for certain. Not whether they would survive takeoff. Not whether the fuel would last. Not whether China would be there when they needed it. They only knew why they were there. For months earlier, Japan had struck Pearl Harbor, and America needed to strike back. This was the answer. It did not look like strategy. It looked like desperation. But in war, desperation sometimes becomes innovation. For months and 11 days earlier, on December 7th, 1941, the American Pacific Fleet had sat quietly at Pearl Harbor. Battleships lined up along Battleship Row. Aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip. A Sunday morning that looked ordinary until the sky filled with Japanese planes. The attack killed 2,390 Americans. Ships burned. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The USS Arizona exploded and sank with more than 1,000 men aboard. But the deepest wound was not only military. It was psychological. America had believed distance made it safe. America had believed oceans were walls. Both beliefs died before noon. Then the news got worse. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. Hong Kong fell. The Philippines were collapsing. Singapore surrendered. Across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, Japan advanced with terrifying speed. For Americans at home, the war felt like humiliation without reply. Newspapers carried defeat after defeat. Coastal cities enforced blackouts. Rumors of Japanese submarines spread along the west coast. The public wanted one thing: retaliation. But hitting Japan was not simple. The Army Air Forces had no base close enough to reach Tokyo and return. Navy carrier aircraft had limited range and small bomb loads. Heavy bombers could not reach Japan from any friendly airfield. China was too difficult to supply. The Soviet Union was neutral in the Pacific. The problem was distance. Japan sat behind an ocean. And in early 1942, that ocean looked unbeatable. President Roosevelt understood that morale was not a luxury. A country that believes it cannot strike back begins to weaken inside. The order was clear. Japan had to be bombed as soon as possible. But no conventional method could do it. So someone had to invent an unconventional one. In Japan, military planners believed the homeland was safe. Geography said so. Distance said so. Their defensive perimeter said so. Patrol boats and observation networks stretched far out into the Pacific, meant to detect any approaching American force long before it could reach launch range. Their logic was sound, but it had one flaw. It assumed America would attack in a way Japan could imagine. Then Captain Francis Lowe noticed something at a naval airfield in Norfolk, Virginia. A runway had been painted with the outline of a carrier deck. Army twin-engine bombers were flying over it. Most officers would have seen nothing important. Lowe saw a question. If a bomber could take off within the length of that painted carrier deck, could it take off from a real one? The idea made no sense. Army bombers belonged on land. Carriers launched Navy aircraft. The two worlds did not mix. But the geometry was there, and suddenly, the impossible became something else. Untested, the idea should have failed on paper. It was too strange, too fragile, too dependent on everything going right in a war where almost nothing ever did. And yet, inside the offices of wartime Washington, it began to take shape. Load Army bombers onto a Navy carrier. Sail within range of Japan. Launch them. Let them bomb. And then let them keep flying. Because there was no way back. It was a one-way mission by design. From the moment the wheels left the deck, the crews would be on their own. The carrier would turn away immediately, running east at full speed, leaving the bombers to cross an ocean, strike their targets, and somehow reach China. Or fail trying. The concept was simple. The implications were enormous. This became what was quietly called Special Aviation Project No. 1. Not because there were others planned, but because there had never been anything like it before. The man chosen to lead it was not accidental. Jimmy Doolittle was not just a pilot. He was an engineer, a record breaker, and a man who understood aircraft at a level few others did. He had flown coast to coast faster than anyone before him. He had pioneered blind flying using instruments alone. He held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering. He knew what airplanes could do. More importantly, he knew how far they could be pushed. He was 45 years old, older than most combat pilots, and valuable enough that many believed he should never be risked. But this mission needed someone who could bridge two worlds that rarely work together, the Army and the Navy. It needed someone who could translate risk into action. It needed Doolittle. The first real question was not how to attack Japan. It was, what aircraft could survive the attempt? The list was short. The North American B-25 Mitchell emerged not because it was perfect, but because everything else was worse. The B-26 was too unstable at low speeds. The B-18 and B-23 were too large for the carrier deck. The B-25, by contrast, had something more valuable than raw performance. It was predictable. It warned before it stalled. It responded cleanly to control. It behaved like an honest machine. For what they were about to attempt, that mattered more than speed or range. Because everything about this mission would live on the edge of control. A quiet test followed. Two B-25s were loaded onto the USS Hornet, CV-8, and launched. No press. No announcements. Just a proof of concept. And it worked. Not comfortably. Not safely. But it worked. The physics held. The carrier's forward speed, combined with the wind, gave the bombers enough lift to leave the deck. The margin was razor thin, but it existed. That was enough. Now the question became harder. Could 16 bombers do it, fully loaded, in combat conditions, at sea? Training began at Eglin Field. The crews were told almost nothing. Only that the mission would be dangerous, and that they could refuse. No one did. A runway was painted to match the length of a carrier deck. At first, the goal was simple: get airborne within 800 feet. Within days, they cut that in half. For 100 feet, then less. The technique was unnatural. Full flaps. Full power against the brakes. Release at maximum engine output. Lift off at the edge of a stall. The aircraft would claw into the air, barely flying. But it worked. One pilot managed to get airborne in just 287 feet. That became the benchmark. They practiced until it felt almost normal. Almost. Then came the reminder. One morning, a B-25 25 stalled at barely 15 feet. It crashed. The crew survived. The aircraft did not. The margin between success and failure was not theoretical. It was measured in seconds, in inches, in instinct. Meanwhile, the bombers themselves were being stripped and rebuilt. Extra fuel tanks were installed wherever space allowed. Inside the bomb bay, above it, even in places never intended to hold fuel. Radios were removed. Guns were reduced. Anything not essential was stripped out. The goal was simple: range. They nearly doubled the aircraft's fuel capacity. Even then, it would barely be enough. And then came one of the strangest solutions of the entire mission. The tail guns were removed. In their place, the crews installed wooden broom handles, painted black to resemble machine gun barrels. A bluff, a fake defense. But in combat, perception could be as powerful as reality. If a Japanese fighter pilot hesitated, even for a second, that might be enough. Desperation and logic had merged into the same idea. On April 2nd, 1942, the Hornet left San Francisco. 16 B-25s were chained to her deck, stretching from bow to stern. She could not launch her own aircraft. She could not defend herself. Her air cover came from another carrier, USS Enterprise CV-6, and the escorting ships around her. She was, in effect, a carrier turned into a delivery system. If discovered, she would be vulnerable. If attacked, she might not survive. At a final meeting, Doolittle sat down with William Halsey Jr., the aggressive commander tasked with taking the force toward Japan. They agreed on one critical point. If the mission was compromised, they would launch anyway, from wherever they were. That decision would define everything that followed. The journey took 16 days. 16 days of open ocean and silence. No radio transmissions. No signals. Nothing that might reveal their position. The Navy crews ran the ship. The Army crews waited. They checked their aircraft again and again. They studied maps they could not yet fully understand. They cleaned weapons, played cards, tried to sleep. And when they could not sleep, they thought. About distance. About fuel. About what would happen after the bombs were dropped. The weather worsened as they moved west. Waves grew higher. Wind stronger. Salt spray washed over the bombers, coating them in corrosion. These aircraft had been built for dry runways. Now they sat in the middle of a violent ocean. There was no proper maintenance, no spare parts, no safety net. A small fuel leak became a serious concern. An instrument error became a risk. Every problem carried weight because nothing could be replaced. And still, the ships moved west, toward a target that should have been unreachable, toward a mission that should not have worked, toward a moment that would prove something neither side yet understood. That war is not only shaped by power, it is shaped by imagination. And imagination was about to break through a wall that distance had built. The final briefings came below deck. Maps were spread across tables. Targets were marked in careful detail. The instructions were precise and, in some ways, restrained. Factories, oil storage, steel works, power plants, military targets only. No civilian areas if they could be avoided. No shrines. No imperial palace. Even in a mission built on risk and improvisation, there were lines that would not be crossed. Above them, the ocean continued to move. And ahead, unseen in the gray distance, sat the edge of Japan's defensive system. A line of small vessels, fishing boats, watching, listening, waiting. The Americans did not know they were there. In the early hours of April 18th, the task force was still more than 650 miles from Japan when radar picked up surface contacts. Small ships, too small to be ignored, too close to be safe. The fleet turned briefly, attempting to avoid detection, then resumed course. But the morning brought another contact. A patrol vessel, Nito Maru No. 23, spotted the American force through rain and low cloud. At that distance, there was no doubt. An 800-foot aircraft carrier does not disappear into weather. The patrol boat transmitted a warning. The message went out. It did not matter if the Americans destroyed the ship afterward. The signal had already traveled. Somewhere in Japan, someone might already be reacting. The clock had changed. Everything had changed. There was no longer a clean approach. No guarantee of surprise. No certainty that Japanese aircraft or submarines were not already moving toward them. And the carriers, Hornet and Enterprise, were not expendable. They were the core of what remained of American naval power in the Pacific. Losing them would not just cancel the mission. It would cripple the war effort. The decision came fast. Jimmy Doolittle and Captain Mark Mitcher made the call. Launch immediately, 10 hours early, 170 miles farther from Japan than planned. The consequences were brutal. Fuel margins, already thin, became critical. The bombers would now operate at the absolute edge of their range. The night approach was gone. They would arrive in daylight. Everything that made the mission difficult had just become worse. And still, there was no alternative. Turning back was not possible. Not politically, not psychologically, not strategically. The order was given. Launch aircraft. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle pushed the throttles forward. His North American B-25 Mitchells surged down the wet deck of the USS Hornet, CV-8, engines screaming, rain hammering the cockpit. The bow rose. The wheels left the deck. And once again, against every reasonable expectation, the aircraft flew. One by one, the others followed. 16 bombers. 16 takeoffs. Not a single failure. 45 days of training had come down to less than an hour. And it worked. The carrier turned east. The bombers turned west. And from that moment on, they were alone. They dropped low, down to wave height, so low that the ocean blurred beneath them. At that altitude, Japanese radar could not see them. The world narrowed to cockpit glass, engine noise, and fuel gauges slowly falling. 6 hours of flight. No radio. No communication. Each aircraft alone in gray sky and gray sea. Then, near noon, Japan appeared. The coastline rose ahead. The bombers climbed. 1,500 feet. Just enough for a bombing run. And suddenly, the impossible became real. Factories. Cities. Streets. People. Japan, unprepared for what it was seeing. The bombers came in low and fast. No formations. No warning. No expectation. They struck targets across Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka. Oil tanks burned. Factories were hit. Power plants damaged. The physical destruction was limited, but that was never the true objective. The real damage was invisible. It was doubt. Japan had believed itself untouchable, protected by distance, protected by its defensive perimeter. And now, American bombers were overhead, in daylight, dropping bombs, then gone. The entire attack lasted minutes, seconds over each target, and then the bombers turned away, southwest, toward China. That was when the real struggle began. Fuel was nearly gone. The early launch had pushed every aircraft beyond its planned limits. Night fell. Weather worsened. The planned airfields in China were dark. The homing beacons never activated. The crews flew into blackness over unfamiliar land with empty tanks. One by one, they bailed out or crash-landed. Of the 16 aircraft, not one survived intact. The entire force was lost. But the men, most survived, rescued by Chinese civilians and soldiers who risked everything to help them, and paid for it. The Japanese retaliation that followed was brutal. Entire regions were devastated. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians killed. The cost of the mission extended far beyond the crews who flew it. Back in America, Doolittle expected punishment. He had lost every aircraft, but he was awarded the Medal of Honor, promoted, celebrated, because the mission had achieved something far greater than damage. It had changed belief. In America, it proved Japan could be reached. In Japan, it proved they were not safe. And that shift, psychological, strategic, set events in motion. It accelerated plans that would lead to the Battle of Midway, a battle that would break the Japanese carrier force, a battle that would shift the war. All of it connected, all of it beginning with 16 bombers launched from a deck they were never meant to use. The Doolittle Raid did not win the war. It barely scratched Japan's industry, but it broke something more important. It broke certainty. Japan had prepared for every logical threat. What it had not prepared for was the impossible. And in war, the impossible is often the thing that matters most. Because once someone proves it can be done, it changes everything.